All right, welcome back to the inaugural Belonging at Work Summit. Our next guest is the incredible Dr. Avis Jones-DeWeever. Dr. Jones-DeWeever is a career reinvention strategist, diversity consultant, and women's empowerment expert, and I'm super excited to be interviewing her today. So if you're not familiar with her work, she is amazing and prolific. She's the founder of the Exceptional Leadership Institute for Women, a global personal and professional development firm that helps established and aspiring entrepreneurs and executives experience accelerated success while building a holistic life they love. So if she doesn't sound busy enough, she also serves as the president of Insight Unlimited, which is a Washington, D.C. based boutique consulting firm, which specializes in diversity consulting, communication strategy, and the development and implementation of impactful research. So I first encountered her work by picking up this amazing book, which is called How Exceptional Black Women Lead. And this was published in 2016. And the book is really packed with cutting edge research and really moving personal stories of about 70 exceptional Black women leaders who relay strategies resulting in breaking away from the pack, making your mark, and overcoming the layered challenges every Black woman faces on her way to the top. So since one of the topics of this year's summit is solely focused on radical inclusion, I'll be asking Dr. Jones-DeWeever to guide us through what it means to radically include Black women and their experiences in the workplace. So we're going to go on this journey together. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those layered challenges every Black woman faces on the way to the top, why this aspect of radical inclusion matters to the future of work. And of course, we're going to gain some everyday strategies to re-examine our own diversity, equity, and inclusion commitments from a lens that intentionally includes Black women. So Dr. Jones-DeWeever, welcome. So thrilled to have you here. Are you ready to help us build workplace cultures of belonging?
I certainly am, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be a part of your summit.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you again. So to kick off the interview, let's go into it. Let's jump into the content of your book, How Exceptional Black Women Lead. And in the first part of the book, you write about what Black women are up against. And you state that Black women in the 21st century have infinitely more choices and opportunities than were commonly afforded to our mothers, grandmothers, and generations before. Yet, some things remain stubbornly unchanged. So can you, this is a big question, but I think it will help with framing. Can you just walk us through what some of those kind of common themes, those stubborn, unchanged things arise in the workplace that by explaining that can help us build greater empathy to really understanding the experiences of Black women in the workplace in particular?
Absolutely. So to me, the one thing that has been consistent throughout our existence as Black women in America is this consistency of work, right? Just work, period, has been a consistent reality in our lives. We didn't require a women's movement in order to be infused into America's labor market, right? We were America's labor market from the very beginning. The challenge that still remains, though, in terms of how we interact within that labor market in the current context, is that though we're still here and we're here in large numbers, in fact, Black women have a higher labor force participation rate than any other group of women in America. So we're very committed to that labor force, and we're very committed to our jobs. We're also very ambitious. Survey research suggests that we are more ambitious than other demographic groups wanting that next promotion. But the specific challenge that we face is that the opportunities that are afforded to us are not commensurate with our ambition or our qualifications or even our stellar performance. We seem to hit, I wouldn't just say a glass ceiling. Some scholars have called it a concrete ceiling. And so we have a particular challenge when it comes to overcoming the intersection barriers of both race and gender in the workplace in order to navigate our way into leadership positions.
Okay, so that is a lot, and I really like how you frame that in the book, where you just kind of you state an obvious, that the fact that Black women have been a part of the labor force since the inception of the United States. A lot of the content of what we're talking about is centered around experience of the workplace in the United States. There wasn't necessarily a women's movement to say, hey, we want to join the workforce. Like, Betty Friedan of the 1950s and talking more about white feminism. So like with that point of just talking about the realities that Black women face and recognizing ambition, but also looking at how Black women are often underestimated in terms of abilities, capabilities, things of that nature. You write in the book really powerfully about recognizing that you would imagine that women of all backgrounds would help one another out. And your research suggests that this is not always the case. And in fact, looking specifically at white women and some of these tensions with Black women, you write about that. And I think that would be helpful just to kind of shine a light about what some of those tensions specifically are, and maybe with greater awareness, how we might be more intentional of kind of recognizing like, oh, this is popping up. How can white women in particular work around some of those tensions, or just to be more aware of them?
Oh my goodness, such a brilliant question. So absolutely. So here's the challenge, right? We live in a world where, let's be real, gender discrimination exists, just as racial discrimination exists, just as homophobia exists, right? We live in this world with all these various oppressions that exist. And I think oftentimes when we're in our individual spaces experiencing discrimination, we only see it from our lens, right? And so that creates a situation where, though one would think in the broader concept that all women, quote unquote, should work together towards combating gender discrimination or sexism, as it comes out in the workplace in terms of how we really sort of attack those issues, when we focus on gender diversity in the workplace, it seems that more often than not, it ends up being primarily white women who benefit from gender diversity programs. And white women do not, writ large, not all, but statistically speaking, it appears as if they are not really holding out a hand in order to extend efforts to diversify gender diversity efforts. It's like they're just happy to get a woman there, but it's as if they are sort of blind to the fact that the women who are primarily benefiting from these efforts are white women. And so it creates a very interesting dynamic that as companies invest more in diversity programs, and in fact, as it stands today, companies tend to even invest more in gender diversity programs than they do on programs that look at racial diversity or other types of discrimination. But in terms of what happens at the end of the day, we've seen a greater, huge escalation, not enough, but a significant escalation of women in leadership, which end up being white women, and a huge decrease in representation and leadership among people of color, and especially among Black women and other women of color. And so what I would suggest is that white women need to become more aware of the fact that gender diversity is not really gender diversity if the women included in those efforts are not racially and ethnically diverse as well.
Yes. And I think in that, I mean, you describe this as the dirty secret in the diversity world, which is not a surprising secret. And it's also, it just seems like, to me, in this space, it's just how can you not take a more holistic approach? And yet this is happening again and again. It's happening right now in 2019 when looking at gender diversity efforts. And so I appreciate you just kind of writing about that and speaking directly towards this tension. And I think awareness is the first step of trying to then kind of go back and think more critically of like, okay, if we're talking about gender diversity, how do we then center those women who are kind of most vulnerable, most underrepresented, which would include women of color, Black women specifically. So I really appreciate that. Kind of going a little bit further, we're talking about gender and race. You stated specifically in the book that racism, either past or present, has quickly developed to that which shall not be named status in America, and particularly in the workplace, which almost feels like this third rail topic, right? Like even when we talk about unconscious bias training, we're not speaking to the isms, but particularly racism through that. Always not, it's kind of it's a easier way, or kind of a more sanitized way of getting at talking about how racism shows up in the workplace. And so and you go further to say when evidence of individual or institutional racism is revealed, it's often met with a suspension of belief and dismissals, kind of frequent dismissals. So talk to us more about what kind of effect continual dismissals of racist transgressions have on black women in particular in the workplace. What is that? How does that impact, when we talk about productivity and innovation? I mean, help us kind of build empathy here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say that it impacts so many things, right? First of all, there's a sense of betrayal. I'm just going to be very blatant about that. Because when you are a member of a workforce, it's not just that you're there. Most people aren't there just because they want to get a paycheck, because there are a gazillion places you can go to get a paycheck, right? Yeah. They're typically there because they believe in a vision. They want to contribute to the team. They are skilled and highly educated and professional in their interactions, and they want to be perceived as such, right? Yet, when something happens that is, at least to them, clearly something that is discriminatory, when someone says something that people just kind of write off as a joke, other people don't take it seriously, but it is offensive to that person if it connects to their historical experience. It's hurtful. That's number one. It is just hurtful. All right. When you have those sorts of aggressions, micro or macro aggressions that sort of pile up over a period of time, what ultimately that leads to is a sort of disconnect from that community in the most sort of deep way possible, so that individuals are more likely now to not really feel as invested in that team, to not really see themselves there over the long term, because they feel as if the environment itself is not welcoming. It is not respectful. And it's not someplace that someone would want to really spend their lives. So ultimately, I think the biggest downfall is that it leads to a lack of retention. The best talent leaves. Okay. Why should they stay? Right.
Right.
So the best talent, they're looking for someplace other opportunities. And then that corporation, that organization is now figuring out, well, now we've invested time, we've invested maybe money into sort of training this person. This person leaves with sort of all of this, historical knowledge about the projects that they were working on. And now we have to start over from scratch. And God forbid, how do we even find, if we're trying to make an effort to diversify the workplace, for a lot of companies, they act like, at least, that's even that much harder to find someone else that might be able to fill that role, right? So it is bad for the company, and that you lose your best talent the quickest.
Yeah.
It might lead up to a bad reputation for the company, which will make it that much harder to attract new quality talent in that role. And ultimately, you're not going to create the types of teams that you need in your organization in order to be able to best maximize the power of the organization, and quite frankly, the profitability of it, depending upon what you do, as it relates to today's and tomorrow's sort of consumer force. Because our consumer base is shifting so greatly in America that you have to be able to connect with diverse people. I mean, you just cannot escape that. That is the America of today, and it's definitely increasingly the America of tomorrow. And so if you want to be able to understand, to speak the language that community will hear, and that will make them want to buy your product or use your services, then you need to be able to have people within your organization that can help you make those connections, and at a minimum, not to make any bad faux pas that will turn off that community in the future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, there's so much really good content that you just shared. The first piece of, it's naming something. I think it's really difficult to name something that's challenging, especially if you believe that you've been disrespected and it's rooted in individual or some kind of system that it's inherently racist, and kind of just shining a light on that. That takes a lot of courage just to bring that up. And then for, as you say, like a suspension of belief, or like a dismissal of your feelings are not valid, or this is not what's really happening. It's kind of that gaslighting, right? Or just this kind of, and you write really powerfully about how that lands for a Black woman in particular, of questioning their own value, capabilities, sense of belonging, right? And this other piece that I really like what you're talking about of, trying to keep your best and brightest, which includes Black women, and trying to connect, if you're in a service-based organization, trying to connect with Black communities, like who best to like help with that than someone who is Black, right? In a leadership position, like it's not rocket science, right? So it's like, but it's kind of like, it kind of harkens back to you have to see it to be it, right? And that like, for Black women, for other marginalized communities, it's really difficult in the workplace where you start looking up the hierarchy and it starts looking whiter and whiter and more male, straighter, more cisgender, like whatever, like more able-bodied, that becomes difficult, right? And so then it goes into, okay, mentorship and sponsorship. You write a lot about that in the book as well. Forging those kind of meaningful relationships with people that are a little bit further down their careers, who are offering that kind of informal guidance and advice. That's a powerful way of building up your confidence, of kind of recognizing capabilities that maybe you didn't see in yourself, feeling like you belong because someone's kind of taking you under their wing. And in your research, you found that Black women run into difficulty forming these types of relationships. So can you share a little bit more about, why this is happening and possible ways that leaders who are watching this right now can disrupt that and can think more strategically, like maybe I should sponsor someone who doesn't look exactly like me or reminds me of my younger self, like all of those things. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So as human beings, we are predisposed to be kind of tribal in nature. That's just how we have survived as human beings throughout our history of being on this planet, right? And so we feel more comfortable oftentimes around people who remind us of us, maybe like a younger version of us, or like reminds us of a cousin or a mom or a dad or a sister, sibling, whatever. And so how that sort of becomes then a challenge for Black women, and quite frankly, often for anyone that's not white male, when it comes to building like sponsorship relationships and mentoring relationship, is that oftentimes people who are in leadership positions are overwhelmingly white and male and cis. Let's just be honest, right? And so there is this specific archetype that is the typical type of person that tends to be in leadership positions in corporations. That does two things. Number one, over time, it creates this cultural sense of normalcy that is the type of person that's supposed to be there.
Right.
Okay. And so that's a big thing that we all have to acknowledge and figure out how can we begin to chip away at the thought that that type of person is just automatically more deserving. Okay. And then secondly, the challenge is that because that person is human, right, they feel more comfortable connecting with people who are like them, just like the rest of us do. Yeah. So it is easier to form more natural mentorships and sponsorship type of relationships with maybe like another young white guy that kind of reminds him of his son, or kind of like a younger version of him. That's the normal part of it. And that is human. But to sort of, and the challenges though, for Black women in particular, is that even though, for example, if that type of person is going to be a lot more cognizant about promoting gender diversity in their work, in their organization, then their closest then sense of normalcy then would be to look towards white women specifically, someone who would remind him of his mother, of his wife, of his daughter, right? At least there's a sense of racial alignment. Even if you're looking at issues of race, that person might be more likely to form a relationship or a bond with a Black male or a Latino, right? Because at least they can bond around their maleness. They can talk about the game that just was played over the weekend, right? They can bond on male issues. Sure. But as it relates to Black women and other women of color, but particularly Black women, there's this sort of double layer of disconnect. They have no place where they can bond. They cannot bond around whiteness. They cannot bond around gender, right? And so they're sort of double outsiders in that way. Yeah. And so to really start to sort of get past that challenge, we really need to have those males who are in those leadership positions to be more cognizant of their choices and be open to forging deeper professional relationships with women of color and, of course, Black women in particular. And the reason why I keep saying Black women in particular is because the statistics show that Black women are especially likely to want to rise, to go up that ladder, to get that promotion. So they want those. They want those relationships, but find it particularly hard to be able to make those bonds happen.
Yeah, yeah. This is super helpful, and I think it's a reminder for people, white men in particular, in leadership positions, really to kind of be conscious, when thinking about the time that you have available and developing the next generation of talent, to really bust out of that kind of tribal thinking, right? And that takes a lot of discipline and consciousness. And have you seen examples of kind of pairings of maybe unlikely mentorship with Black women and folks that are in leadership positions that might give our viewers some confidence that there's a possibility model out there?
Absolutely. So, for example, one of the women in my book, who was and still is a VP at IBM, talked about early in her years there, how one of her best mentors was her white male boss. And he was the type of person who would make sure that she met the people that she needed to meet. He would give her very honest feedback that she could then use to go and sort of apply in her career to move to that next level. I'm thinking of one, and this is kind of very controversial. Who knows? It may have been illegal, but he told her. I remember she told me this story one time about how when she came back to work after maternity leave, and as is often the case, I mean, when you have children, you gain weight, right? So she came back to work after maternity leave, and they had a conversation, and he told her very gently that she really need to focus on maybe losing those next few pounds. It's a horrible thing to say. And this was many years ago, like I said, and it may be illegal, may have been illegal then.
Yeah.
But at that moment, she felt that it may have been hard to hear, but she knew that at that moment, there was a certain, unfortunately, and all women know this, right? We all know this, that there is this certain look, right? That for some reason is seen as more professional, and that she wasn't being seen as professional. And she even told me that she felt glad that even though that was an uncomfortable conversation that he had with her, that she interpreted it as he was really looking out for her best interest, because basically he was probably telling her what other people were telling him.
Yeah.
And he wanted to succeed.
It's
right?
and it's such a balance, right? Because it then might go back to this feeling of betrayal, right? Where it's like, I thought you were my mentor and you supportive of me, and you're kind of like not looking at the caliber of my work. You're like literally looking at how I'm showing up, and like it's almost like these unwritten rules of, like you said, what people are telling him, and he's translating that, but maybe not having the emotional intelligence of like, how do you translate that in a way that's not seen as sizist or kind of,
right.
And so it's tricky, but it's also, but there are, I think like the whole point of that question for you is really like giving people hope that there are these kind of possibility models of matching kind of senior leaders with Black women in this instance,
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's possible.
Exactly. And let me just say, I just think this is very important for people to understand. How do you get to that level of transparency in a relationship where people tell you that, right? Because you have to have a close bond for that type of uncomfortable conversation to occur. Not that it's right, but at least it happened. And she believes that helped her to even be able to ascend at that time. This was many, many years ago. But I will say that she was saying that her main thing that she made sure she did from day one was she understood the importance of showing up outside of work. Like, you cannot build the type of relationships that you need with decision makers and with gatekeepers, because it's not always about the person in the executive office. 9 times out of 10, it's about the relationship that you have with the person that's outside that executive office that can make sure you get in there, right?
Yep.
And so the best way to forge those type of relationships is you need to go to those after work functions. You need to go to those happy hours. You need to hang out with folk outside of work so you can get some sort of maybe some information, some intelligence about what's on the horizon, what opportunities are going to be coming up that maybe haven't been made public yet, but also so that you can start to build those relationships, those deep relationships with people, human to human, that oftentimes you really just don't get a chance to do when you're in the nitty gritty of just getting it done inside the workplace.
Yeah, and that is great advice, for folks that aren't doing that, knowing kind of these unwritten rules where you're absolutely right. Kind of those, like a lot of the decision making that happens is informal and it's happening outside of kind of the meetings that are structured around making the decisions. And kind of, recognizing that that's there, whether or not that's helpful with your work-life balance. That's a whole other, we can have a whole other topic, which is happening later this week on self-care. But yeah. Okay. So kind of shifting and looking at kind of the 70 women that you interviewed, these are Black women who have ascended, into leadership positions in a variety of sectors, including entrepreneurial space. So for Black women leading organizations, talk to us a little bit more about how these leaders in particular have to navigate around harmful race and gender stereotypes that you talk about, and specifically how Black women have to lead in a different way when they're holding their team accountable for results. So what are some of those kind of unique kind of, I guess, like stereotype threats that Black women have to kind of navigate around?
All right. So in terms of dealing with sort of navigating leadership as a Black woman, like leading as a Black woman and dealing with the particular stereotype challenges that we face, probably the biggest one is that whole angry Black woman trope, right? As leaders, it is your responsibility to set the vision, but also hold people accountable, right? It's your vision. It's your responsibility to set deadlines and make sure that those deadlines are hit. But how people receive critiques by Black women can oftentimes be very different than if they received that very same critique from a male space, from a male perspective, and definitely from a white male. And so I think the challenges about Black women is that we really have to, in many ways, and we are very cognizant of that. And sometimes we even overcompensate and go so far in trying to build sort of like a friendship sort of relationship with our team that we're not as effective as we could be. And so it's very important to understand that you have to sort of balance this. And I think it's very important that we know that the best way to do that is to sort of get out in front of it from the very beginning by setting the clear direction, clear goals, clear timetables. But also when it's time, if there comes a time to have a difficult conversation when things aren't being done or when deadlines aren't being met, really this is the time where you really want to be able to make sure that you are communicating with people in very fact-based conversation, trying to sort of eliminate any sort of, here's the challenge that we face. Here's the biggest challenge. Yeah. It is oftentimes when critique comes from this Black woman veneer. The challenge is that most people, before they start their careers, they have come from a very homogeneous background. That's the case for all of us. Most of us grew up in neighborhoods that the people within those neighborhoods look very much like us, which means that the schools that we go to, the children in those schools look very much like us. The places where we worship, the people in that space look very much like us. And even in colleges, for most of us, it's a very homogeneous experience. And so it's not until we get to the workforce that we are in a space where we have to connect on a deep level and work with over a long period of time with people that are different from us. And here we are in this high stakes situation where our livelihoods depend on us working, getting together and getting this right, that we have to sort of figure this out at the same time that we're delivering in the workforce. Yeah. The challenge that Black women face as it relates to this is that for most people, the only sort of version of Black womanhood that they are familiar with are these images that they've seen. It's the sort of Nene Leakes of the Real Housewives of Atlanta. That sort of, stereotype of this loud, aggressive, angry, drink throwing, Black woman is what people think. So when they see a Black woman who is looking to hold them accountable. So even if it is subconsciously, they're thinking, oh my God, she's going to go off. She's going to start cursing. She's going to do this. She's going to do that. And we have to somehow, unfortunately, navigate that reality. It's not fair, but it's the truth. And so I think part of that is understanding that sometimes it's useful to document as much as you can via email communication, so that you can show that there's direction, there's deadline, there's not nasty language. Because I'm telling you, oftentimes you have people who are overly sensitive. I mean, I want to be very honest here. There's a sort of phrase that Black women say oftentimes around challenges that we faced in this space around quote unquote white women's tears, right? That particularly when we're dealing with holding white women accountable on our team, that there's this show of emotion among them that then garners sympathy for them. But at the same time, it makes Black women out to be these evildoers, right? Yeah. And so that might require that you have other people in the room so that you can, other people can witness that you're not being abusive. Yeah. I mean, it's a shame that we have to go through these additional protective measures when we're just trying to do our jobs. But the reality is, oftentimes when it's just one person's word against the next person's word, and the overarching culture has this notion that Black women are loud and boisterous and violent and angry, we are at a disadvantage when it's a he said, she said, or even a she said situation. And so, to the best that we can document our direction and our critiques, as well as maybe having courageous conversations with other people, and to some extent in the room, to be able to acknowledge that we aren't being abusive, but we're just giving feedback. Those are some of the protective measures that sometimes we have to implement such that we aren't, in essence, thrown under the bus because other people aren't living up to their end of the professional bargain.
Yeah, I mean, this is big in that in the book you talk about this as well, where just to get to that level of leadership, you have to be 6 times better than kind of your white male counterpart, right? And by the time you get there, then it's this additional, you're doing the work of a leader. You're kind of driving the vision, you're setting goals, and you're holding people accountable to those goals. There's this whole other set of kind of rules for Black women around then how to lead in a way that is different, and it's this whole other, again, it's a double standard. And I think what you wrote in the book of this kind of the guidance, in addition to kind of documenting and making sure other people are in the room when you're providing critical feedback that's going to make your team better, right? It's this whole piece of being fair, being firm, be in control of your tone, facial expressions. Absolutely. It's just this higher sense of awareness, which, whoa, if that's in every leader, I think our world would be a lot healthier, right? That's a whole other conversation. But you write this one piece where above all else, never let them see you sweat, right? Where it's this kind of it's almost like you have to be beyond human, it's superhuman in a way. And like you said, it's not fair, right? But what's the kind of the positive side of, as much as the deck is not, it's stacked against Black women, it's not fair in leadership positions, how do you spin that around, when you're running your Leadership Empowerment Institute and you're talking to other Black women, because of those experiences, those resiliencies, how do you empower from that, knowing that it's just trying to have a more positive spin on kind of this reality?
Absolutely. So it's an excellent question, because we can get, if we allow ourselves to get sort of stuck in the muck of these extra burdens and the unfairness of it all, right? But also we can look at the beauty of who we are, like what we've overcome, how we're able to get here and be here and perform at this level, and really recognize that as an absolutely extraordinary achievement and be proud of that. I think to answer your question, what's the beautiful thing about being a Black woman and bringing that experience is because I think we have a level of empathy around a number of different aspects of society that allows us to be able to lead with that empathy. So it's like being that type of empathetic leader that I think gets it done because we've experienced racism, because we've experienced sexism, because many of us have experienced classism or a number of other, we've lived that. It's not a academic exercise for us. That as leaders, I think that we then are a lot more sensitive to what the world is like, specifically around those issues. And so I think that then our leadership is one that is based in just such a strong sense of character and morality from being shaped by that experience, that once we're able to sort of navigate those challenges to get to where we are, I think that does produce really great outcomes for those spaces. Now, it's disturbing to see, and I've seen this a couple of times, and the research suggests that oftentimes these opportunities to lead, though, sometimes don't come up as often until the predecessor really just screws it up. So you have this, so you have to basically, in essence, clean up somebody else's mess, right?
Yep.
And then, so it's like it's not even that you're starting off from here. You're starting off at a disadvantage, with sort of creating a sense of sort of excellence out of being dropped in a position of chaos. And so that's challenging. And it's also challenging that oftentimes we aren't given as much grace if we make a mistake than other people are given when they make a mistake. Right. But I do think that we come to these positions, as I mentioned, with a level of life experience that's helpful. We also come to these positions with an experience of having leadership experience outside of the workforce. So we're more likely to be leaders in our communities in various respects, in social organizations and religious organizations. Even at our schools, we are very likely to step up in leadership. So leadership isn't new to us. All of those things, I think, work to our advantage and makes us particularly effective leaders and really huge assets for teams and for organizations that are smart enough to see that and to tap into it.
I love that. And I really want to reemphasize kind of the ability to lead with empathy and the fact that I think that's the future model of leadership. So that's definitely a positive spin for Black women leaders. So you also write in the book this piece, and we talked a little bit about this before, but I think it's important to specifically focus in on it, about the term quote unquote women's leadership. And you say that this is often typically a proxy for talking about white women leadership, just as when kind of talking about Black leadership, you say that most often references positions held by Black men. So we just recognize there are many Black women leaders doing awesome work. There's 70 of them featured in your book. So what are ways that we can dismantle this erasure of Black women leaders altogether, and just to kind of challenge these stereotypes when they arise?
No, thank you. Man, this is such a stellar interview.
Thank you. Thanks. I try.
Or you're succeeding.
Thank you.
It is so important that we're cognizant of that, because I think most people just, as I mentioned previously, just see this as normal, right?
Yeah.
And it's really, as a Black woman, if I'm just looking at this, for example, from the lens of Black organizations specifically, it's so frustrating because I can look at those organizations and see that the people that are doing the rubber to the road work are Black women. Right. But the person that's at center stage is typically a Black man, right? And so similarly, Black women very dedicated to the workforce, putting a lot of effort in, coming in with great credentials, great experiences, but hitting that hard wall and not ascending up the ladder. And so, what do we really do about this? I think it's all of our responsibilities, not only within organizations, not only in the workforce, but just in general society, that we stop accepting the normalcy that leaders only come in a certain package. that leaders should only be male, or that leaders should only be white, or whatever that situation is. We should say, we should question, why aren't there more leaders that are diverse in a variety of spaces? And this would even include the nonprofit space. I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. The nonprofit industry is disproportionately an industry that is made up of people of color working there. But still, those are largely white-led organizations. And so we have to stop thinking that those people who have the ability to on the ground get it done, and who are working overtime to make sure change happens, or to meet deadlines, or to make it happen in whatever context that they're working, that somehow there's this element that's never named that somehow they can't meet, that would then make them qualified to be leaders. Right. We need to stop getting over that. We need to get over that and begin to sort of think as a society that leadership can and does come in every different package, every different gender, every different race, every different form of difference that you can think of. There are leaders everywhere. The difference is who's given a chance to lead and who's shut out.
Yes. Yeah. And it's I like the way that you describe that of just kind of looking at Black women in particular and the qualifications of leadership. And it's almost like there's a goalpost and it keeps getting moved further and further away from
exactly.
like being qualified to step in and do really good work. Thinking about this reality and knowing that there are many leaders watching this conversation right now. For those folks committed to thinking about their commitments around diversity, equity, and inclusion, trying to make more organizations that are more inclusive, where would you suggest they start to consider, based on this conversation, to radically include Black women in more meaningful ways in the workplace, no matter where they are currently in the organization?
I think it's first of all important that they acknowledge and be very intentional about making sure that every gender diversity effort that they have is diverse in and of itself racially. Yeah. So making sure that there are women of color included in their gender diversity efforts. I had an opportunity to work with this major corporation around this was just a basic training and keynote / situation. And they were very proud in telling me about their sort of gender diversity program that they had just started and had elevated a number of women through this program. And I just asked them, are any of them people of color? Right? And their question was no. And their answer was no. And so then my next sort of logical question to follow that up was, okay, well, surely I need to talk about that, and we'll talk about ways to overcome that. And they were like, no, we don't want to address that. That type of attitude to change.
Yeah.
That needs to change. That's a big problem. That's a big problem. Yes. When you create a situation, you see that you are, in essence, sort of shutting a certain group out, and then you don't even want to acknowledge what you're doing after you're aware of it. That's a problem. So I think my biggest challenge to organizations are to be brave and be intentional, and to be very specific about ensuring that doors are open for everyone, and that a wide variety of people are considered for various positions. It is not acceptable in this day and age to claim that you cannot find. Okay.
Yes.
It's because it's just not true.
Yes.
And oftentimes people are in your organizations that are ready, willing, and able today to contribute at that next level. And they can't figure out why is it that they continue to be overlooked. If there's something that you need to put in place to improve leadership development and professional development opportunities, if you believe that's the problem, then put that in place. If you need to make sure that you put in place rules to ensure that you diversify who you even interview for various situations, so that you're not just interviewing very homogeneous populations, then you need to do that. But the bottom line is you need to hold yourself accountable to not ending up in outcomes that you are too embarrassed to even acknowledge exists.
Yeah. Yeah. So on one of the pieces that you talked about before, let's say an organization says yes, absolutely to everything that you said, um, and I don't know, say there's a position, a CEO position open, um, and and the organization is ready to onboard a Black woman as the next CEO. What kind of work, like when is an organization good for that particular Black woman? Meaning, like, what kind of things culturally need to shift in order to kind of alleviate some of that, the additional rules that a Black woman needs to kind of adhere to, in order to avoid some of those stereotype threats that you talked about a little bit earlier.
Absolutely. So the big word here is inclusion. You have to create an inclusive and a culture. And I believe that when you truly create an inclusive culture, that equity part of the DE&I will fall into place, right?
Yeah.
But I really think it's sort of it is an eventual thing. It's almost like I wouldn't say cyclical, but it is a domino effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that a lot of companies stop at the diversity thing. They
Yeah.
feel like if they have a certain number of people like represented, that's enough. It's literally like almost like a bean counting exercise. The diversity thing is enough for them. What they don't understand that the biggest challenge is to create a truly inclusive environment. And when I use that word, I mean creating an environment where every individual, no matter who they are, no matter what their background is, no matter their sexual orientation, their race, their gender, all of that stuff, that they believe that they can, and they are shown through the actions of that company that they can bring their whole selves to work every day and not feel like they ever have to hide a part of themselves or compartmentalize a part of themselves in order to be accepted. When you truly create that inclusive environment where you allow each person to really be themselves and be a full and legitimate member of the team, then you will begin to be able to put in place those sort of conditions that are necessary in order to create equitable an opportunity that could lead to outcomes like having a Black woman as CEO of the organization. So that means that when she gets in those positions, if you've really created an inclusive space, then she shouldn't be held to different standards than her white male predecessor, for example. That she shouldn't have like only one strike in terms of the possibility of making a mistake, whereas the person who came before her had 10 strikes. Those sorts of situations should not happen if you do the hard work of really creating a culture of inclusion that values each individual as who they are, and not just looking to sort of make everyone sort of meld down into one specific cultural ideal that tends to be that of sort of the dominant culture, but sort of in disguise for everyone else. If you create that environment, you would have already set her up in this position where she's more likely to flourish.
Yes. And I think that goes back to what you said just a little bit before about organizations being brave. And when a leader like yourself comes in to say, how is that gender diversity initiative going? Where are the women of color? Where are Black women? An organization, instead of taking that defensive posture of like, well, we didn't do that and we don't want you to talk about this. It's like, like kind of like that aspect of inclusive leadership of maybe being curious and listening, right? I think that's the piece where when you talk about inclusion, it's just like the basic starting point of active listening. And then what do you do with that kind of feedback and being okay with it, where it's like, we're not perfect. We acknowledge that. No one wants us to be, but we're going to try to get better, right? I mean, this maybe starting with that, which again seems really 101, but sometimes it's important just to go back to basics, because that's yeah,
absolutely critical. It may seem basic because for a lot of us, it is basic to us, but for a lot of people, it isn't, right? It really is. And I think the part that people miss when it comes to that very essential element in terms of being open and non-defensive and listening and being able to think creatively, now how can I address these challenges? Because no organization is perfect. Let's just be real about that.
Totally.
No person is perfect. But here's what I think sort of one of the tips that I give people when I do work in workshops on inclusion is this issue of you have to sort of, as an organization, make it okay for people to talk. And one basic sort of quote unquote rule that we need to have then if we're going to have this sort of directive as an organization is that in terms of making it okay for people to have, when I say just talk, I mean having courageous conversations, right? Being able to talk about things that may be perceived as controversial, is to do that from the standpoint of when we're having these courageous conversations, come into them, at least each individual needs to come into it with at least the thought or the predisposition that the other person really is coming from a place of good intent. That may not always be the case, but if it is at least put on the table that, okay, I'm going to try to interpret what they're saying and from the framework that they're coming into this conversation with a position of good intent, right? That once again leads us back to this issue of empathy, where you're trying to listen to what that person is saying, specifically from their standpoint, and to try to understand what's behind that. And then in return, they do that same thing for you, right? Mm-hmm. And it's really when you sort of set that as a basic sort of condition or expectation within an organization, that can lead to situations where it becomes less scary for people to have conversations and for people to address controversial or potentially embarrassing issues. Like that, or I wish that organization would have said, yes, we need to talk about that. I don't really understand how that happened. Maybe we need to explore. Let's have a conversation about how we can explore how we can make sure that this gender diversity program really is more diverse, right? Instead of taking the question as an attack on something that you did was wrong. Now, something that they did apparently was wrong, but it doesn't mean that it's not insurmountable. There are things that you can do to improve and change. We're all learning this every day. As I mentioned, we come from very homogeneous neighborhoods. We went to very homogeneous schools. We worship in very homogeneous places. And so we're all trying to figure this out for the first time as adults under high stakes situations. Yeah. Okay. That's just the reality that we function under. And therefore, we need to not be defensive when something shows up that may not have been our intent, but instead say, well, if I want to look at this from the position of that question was raised from a place of positive intent and that she wants us to be better, then you can then be less defensive when things come to the fore that you may not be very proud of.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's the ability, to set goals around, whatever those goals were around the gender diversity program, and knowing that you will need to course correct. And that's a part of any kind of initiative in the workplace. But I mean, if it's a true commitment, of course, like we don't have, if there was a silver bullet approach of making workplaces better, we would already be there. Right. And so I think it's just that humility of knowing no single person has all the answers, but collectively we're going to get better. And especially bringing in an expert like yourself, some things, and kind of like lifting, like being grateful for that kind of feedback as opposed to being fearful of it because it, the package doesn't look as sparkly or as pretty. So just one more kind of general question for you. And then I want to make sure that all of our audience members know where to find you so they can benefit from your expertise too. So this is just kind of going back to your book, which is this is more out of curiosity. As a trans guy, I found this book so amazing. One, because it helped me be more empathetic to the experiences of Black women in the workplace. And two, I think so much of what you share around leadership resonates for a lot of other folks. Like I recently read Stacey Abrams' book on minority leadership where, right? Like who knows, maybe she's riffing off of your book because she wrote it hers after yours. So I'm like, I see some parallels here, but, I'm just curious, like, did you envision when you were writing the book that it had the ability to transfer to other underrepresented folks in the workplace? Or was that just kind of like an added benefit to the feedback that you get after the book is done and it's out in the world?
Well, I was hoping that it would, although I thought it was important that at least for that book, my first book, that it centered the Black women's experience because of the issues. Well, first of all, I am a Black woman, so it's lived experience for
Sure.
me.
Yeah.
And also because of the data that I mentioned earlier in terms of that demographic group being especially ambitious but not getting the opportunity. But I also understand the nature of oppression in America.
Mm.
And not only in America, I do a lot of work internationally, and I see the nature of oppression around the world. And the sad, or maybe good thing, if you want to look at it from the positive side, is that oppression is stunningly consistent no matter where it shows up in the world. And the positive side of that is that if we can figure out how to fix it one place, we can figure out how to fix it everywhere, right? Because it is consistent, right? And my goal with this was to sort of rip back the covers. It's like pulling off a Band-Aid. You know, do it, but you have to do it in order for us to sort of see the wound and to begin to treat the wound. I feel like for so long, and we continue to in many ways, try to skate around it, try to tiptoe over it, and not really address these issues directly in terms of how oppression shows up in the workplace, be it against Black women, be it against trans women and men, be it against other people of color. We do not like to directly address that. And even with the issue of gender diversity, it is getting more popular to address that now. But I would say that it's very interesting to me when we look at this issue of gender diversity. Obviously, there's still sexism in the world. Obviously, we've just experienced this huge Me Too movement in America that has brought a whole new layer of dynamics in terms of how we address these issues in the workplace.
Right.
But the reality is that we find it very difficult to face things frontally, particularly in America, around oppression and division and racism and sexism and homophobia, because we come from such an ugly history in those places. And oftentimes we just feel better not talking about it and thinking that we can just move forward from here and ignore it. But I tell you, it's one thing that I've learned over the years is that nothing improves through ignoring it. Mm-hmm. You have to face it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then think strategically about how can I specifically and bravely begin to attack it. And so I'm glad, it makes me feel glad that you're saying that you see parallels there, because I truly believe that if we can figure out how to get this right for Black women, we would have cracked the code to get this right for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm there with you, and I love your work. So I'm looking forward to, do you have another book coming out soon? Or?
You have pushed me.
Please write one. We need it. We need it. But this is awesome. I mean, it's such a good book. So we're really lucky to have you a part of the summit. And so that people can, when you're ready for your next book, not to put any pressure, but where they can find you, what's the best place online where people can be more familiar with who you are and your work?
So I'm going to point them to blackwomenlead.com. They can get more information about the book there. They can even download a career vision and action guide there that can help them as they begin to sort of maybe make some changes in their careers. But also I have some more dynamic information that I'll be adding to that site so that they can get in touch with me directly, but also get more information about how to make the most of their careers.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones DeWeever. We're really lucky again to have you here. And all of the information you just shared will be included on our webpage for the summit, including workbooks and some other takeaways from the conversation. I want to leave the audience with a quote from your book, which I feel like is hopefully will empower all of the change agents out there, which is let the odds be your guide, or let not the odds be your guide as to your possibilities in life. Make your own odds. Take off the shackles of predefined limitations and fully and freely allow yourself to soar. That's so beautiful. I'm inspired by your work, so thank you again. And for everyone tuning in, thank you so much for your time, and let's continue to build workplace cultures of belonging. Thank you.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. For everyone watching, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, if you want more time with these talks, if you'd like additional resources for doing this work in your organizations, and if you'd like to join our community calls after the summit, you can check out our options for getting extended access to all of the sessions and other helpful goodies using the link below. Every purchase also helps me pay the speakers for their generosity, wisdom, and labor in helping us grow the belonging movement. Thank you, and thanks again to today's featured belonging champion.